My best friend told my childhood crush I was gay to date her himself. I'd been in love with Julia since we were 10, and she moved in across the street. We grew up doing homework together, walking to school, and spending summers at the local pool. I was always too nervous to say anything, but we had this connection where we'd talk until 3 in the morning about everything. My neighbor friend Colton lived next door, and the three of us hung out constantly, but it was always Julia and me who paired off for projects or sat together at movies. Colton would joke about being the third wheel, but I thought he was cool with it. When high school started, I decided senior year would be when I'd finally tell Julia how I felt. I wanted us both to be mature enough and have college figured out first. Colton knew about my plan because I told him everything like an idiot. He said he'd help me plan the perfect confession for graduation night. Meanwhile, he started hanging around Julia more when I wasn't there. He'd show up at her house right after I left for my part-time job. He'd text her constantly about homework help, even though he was failing most of his classes, and she knew it. Junior year, Colton told Julia he was worried about me. He said I'd been confused about my sexuality and was using her as a cover to seem straight. He showed her fake text messages where I supposedly told him I was gay, but scared to come out because of my religious parents. He even created this whole story about a guy from another school I was secretly dating. Julia believed him because why would Colton lie about something so serious? She started giving me space, thinking she was being supportive of my journey. When I tried to hang out, she'd invite other people so I wouldn't feel pressure to pretend we were romantic. She stopped our late-night talks because Colton told her I felt obligated to maintain appearances. I was confused why she was pulling away, but Colton said she was probably just stressed about college applications. He offered to talk to her for me and find out what was wrong. Instead, he started dating her. He told her he'd been in love with her for years but didn't want to hurt me. He said now that I was gay, he could finally be honest about his feelings. Julia thought she was doing me a favor by dating him, since it would remove any pressure for me to fake attraction to her. She even thanked me once for being such a good friend, and said she hoped I'd find a nice guy who deserved me. I was completely lost about what was happening. Colton would bring Julia to group hangouts and make out with her in front of me, thinking I didn't care because I was supposedly gay. He'd make jokes about how we could be each other's wingmen now. He even asked me for advice about what Julia liked, saying gay guys gave the best relationship tips. The whole school thought I was gay but closeted, which explained why I never dated anyone. Girls stopped seeing me as an option, and guys I barely knew started trying to set me up with their gay friends. My parents kept asking why I never brought girlfriends home, and if there was something I wanted to tell them. Colton had created this entire false reality around me, and I didn't even know it. Everything crashed down senior year when Julia needed to use Colton's laptop for a presentation. His browser history was open, and she saw hundreds of searches about how to convince someone you're gay, how to fake text conversations, and specifically how to make a girl think her crush is homosexual. She also found searches about me that were creepy, like my work schedule, my college choices, and when I'd be away from home. She confronted him, and he tried to say it was research for a psychology project. But then she found the fake text app on his phone with our supposed conversations about my sexuality. She realized everything was fabricated. Julia came to my house crying at midnight. She told me everything Colton had done and asked if I was actually gay. I told her I'd been in love with her since we were 10 and had planned to tell her after graduation. She was horrified at how thoroughly Colton had manipulated both of us. She'd wasted 2 years dating someone she didn't even like because she thought she was helping me. The next day at school, Julia broke up with Colton in the cafeteria during lunch. The cafeteria goes completely silent after Julia's announcement, and every single person is staring at me with confusion written all over their faces. Colton's expression shifts from shock to panic as he realizes his entire scheme just collapsed in front of half the senior class. I'm frozen in place, my brain struggling to process that Julia just publicly confirmed she knows the truth about Colton's lies. My hands are shaking, and I can feel heat spreading across my face as hundreds of eyes bore into me. People at nearby tables lean forward, phones already in their hands, waiting to see what happens next. Colton's face goes from pale to red as he opens his mouth to say something, but Julia cuts him off before he can get a word out. She holds up her phone with screenshots of his browser history clearly visible on the screen. Her voice carries across the silent cafeteria as she tells everyone within earshot that Colton fabricated an entire fake identity for me to manipulate her into dating him. The cafeteria erupts in shocked whispers, and people pulling out their phones to text others about what's happening. I hear someone behind me gasp, and another person says something that sounds like disbelief. Tables of students huddle together, pointing at their phones as messages fly through group chats. Colton tries to grab Julia's arm, but she yanks it away from him. He's saying something about her being confused and emotional, his voice cracking with desperation. But she's not backing down. She swipes through more screenshots on her phone, showing them to the people closest to her. I can see his fake text app conversations, the ones where he pretended to be me talking about being gay. My stomach twists as I realize how many people are seeing the evidence of what he did. Carly Atkinson stands up from her table and walks over to Julia, putting her hand on her shoulder. I finally find my voice and walk over to Julia, my legs feeling like they might give out under me. The crowd parts slightly as I move through them. I ask if we can talk privately because this is too much to process in front of an audience. My voice sounds weird and distant to my own ears. Julia nods and we leave together while Colton stands there looking like his world is ending, which I guess it is. His friends at the table are staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. As we walk toward the cafeteria exit, Carly follows us out and tells me she always thought something was weird about the whole situation. She says Colton would get defensive whenever she asked Julia questions about their relationship. The hallway feels quieter after the noise of the cafeteria, but I can still hear the buzz of voices through the doors behind us. We end up in an empty classroom on the second floor, the one where nobody has class during lunch period. Julia breaks down crying and apologizing over and over for believing Colton's lies. Tears stream down her face and her shoulders shake. I tell her she has nothing to apologize for because Colton manipulated both of us with fake evidence and elaborate stories. She pulls out her phone again with shaking hands. She reveals she spent all night going through Colton's laptop and phone after finding the browser history, discovering months of searches about me and planning documents. Her voice breaks as she talks. She shows me everything she found on her phone, swiping through screenshots she took as evidence. There's a detailed timeline Colton kept of my schedule, down to what time I left for work and when I got home. Notes about how to keep us apart, including reminders to text Julia during times he knew I'd want to hang out with her. Even practice conversations he wrote out for different scenarios where someone might question his story. The level of calculation is disturbing and makes me realize this wasn't just a stupid mistake, but a deliberate campaign. Each screenshot makes me feel sicker than the last. She says she feels sick thinking about how she thanked me for being supportive while dating the person who was actively destroying my life. Her hands are trembling so badly she almost drops her phone. I take a deep breath and admit that I've been in love with her since we were 10 years old and had planned to tell her after graduation like an idiot. The words tumble out before I can stop them. Julia starts crying harder and says she had feelings for me too back then, but thought I only saw her as a friend. She wipes at her eyes with the back of her hand. We sit there at two desks pushed together, realizing that Colton stole 2 years from us based on calculated lies, and there's no way to get that time back. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead in the silence. Carly comes back to check on us, knocking softly on the classroom door before entering. She says the entire school is talking about what happened in the cafeteria. She shows us her phone where group chats are exploding with people discussing Colton's manipulation and questioning everything they thought they knew. Messages scroll past faster than I can read them. Several people are posting apologies to me for trying to set me up with guys or making assumptions about my sexuality. Brody's name appears multiple times saying he feels terrible. The assistant principal finds us 10 minutes later, slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs. She says we all need to come to the office because the cafeteria incident is causing major disruption. Classes after lunch are starting, but nobody can focus. As we walk through the halls, people are staring and whispering, but now it feels different, like they're seeing me as a victim rather than someone living a lie. Some students step aside to let us pass. Others openly stare with their mouths hanging open. Colton is already in the office when we arrive, sitting in one of the chairs outside the principal's door. He's looking pale and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. His leg bounces nervously and his hands grip the armrests. The principal separates us into different rooms and calls our parents to come in for emergency meetings. I end up in the counselor's office with its motivational posters and tissue boxes. My mom arrives first, still wearing her work badge. She's completely confused about what's happening since she thought I was gay, based on how I'd been acting distant about dating. When I explain Colton's entire scheme, showing her the screenshots Julia forwarded to my phone, she looks horrified. Her face goes through about 5 different expressions in 10 seconds. She immediately asks why I didn't tell her people were making assumptions about my sexuality. I explain that I didn't even know people thought I was gay until recently because Colton had been managing information and keeping me isolated from certain conversations. He'd intercept questions from friends, answer for me in group settings, and make sure I never heard what people were really saying. My mom gets angry on my behalf and demands to speak with Colton's parents when they arrive. Her voice rises and the counselor has to ask her to calm down. The principal says this situation involves potential harassment and defamation that the school takes seriously. She's already called the district office to report the incident. Julia's parents arrived at the office 15 minutes later, and I could hear her dad's voice through the wall before I even saw him. He pushed through the door with her mom right behind him, both of them looking worried and confused. The principal brought them into the room where Julia was sitting, and I heard her mom gasp when Julia started explaining what Colton had done. Her dad's face went red and he stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He asked where Colton was and said he wanted to talk to him right now. The principal had to physically step between him and the door while explaining that wouldn't be appropriate. Julia's mom pulled Julia into a hug and started crying, asking why she didn't tell them something was wrong during those 2 years. Julia tried to explain that she didn't know anything was wrong because she thought she was helping me by dating Colton. Her dad turned to the principal and demanded to know what the school was going to do about this situation. He pointed out that he'd known me since I was 10 years old and always thought Julia and I would end up together eventually. The principal assured him they were taking it seriously and had already contacted the district office. Julia's mom kept apologizing to Julia for not noticing that her relationship with Colton seemed off. She said looking back there were signs, like how Colton would get upset when Julia wanted to spend time with other friends, or how he always had an excuse for why I couldn't hang out with them. Julia's dad asked if I was okay and said Colton better stay far away from both of us. My mom came over from the other room, and the two moms started talking about how neither of them suspected anything. Julia's dad paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair and muttering about pressing charges. The principal said they needed to let the school resource officer finish his investigation first. The resource officer arrived 20 minutes later, wearing his uniform and carrying a tablet for taking notes. He introduced himself and explained he needed formal statements from everyone involved because the principal wanted official documentation of the harassment. He started with me, asking me to describe the timeline of when I noticed things changing with Julia and when I found out about Colton's lies. I walked him through junior year when Julia started pulling away, how Colton offered to help figure out what was wrong, and how I had no idea people thought I was gay until recently. He typed everything I said into his tablet, asking follow-up questions about specific incidents and dates. Then he brought Julia in, and she gave her statement about finding Colton's browser history, the fake text app, and all the searches about me. She showed him the screenshots she'd saved on her phone as evidence. The officer's expression got more serious as he scrolled through the images, especially when he saw the searches about my schedule and personal information. He asked Julia if Colton had ever threatened her or tried to stop her from talking to other people. She admitted he would get upset when she made plans without him and would show up places where she was supposed to meet friends. Carly came in next and confirmed she'd witnessed the cafeteria breakup and heard Julia explain about the fake texts. She added that several other students had noticed Colton's controlling behavior toward Julia, but nobody said anything because they thought it was just normal relationship stuff. The officer asked for names of potential witnesses, and Carly gave him a list of people who'd seen various incidents over the past 2 years. Colton's parents showed up while the officer was still taking statements, and his mom immediately started defending him. She said this was all a big misunderstanding between teenagers who were confused about their feelings. His dad claimed Colton was just trying to help me figure out my sexuality, and Julia was overreacting to some internet searches. The officer cut them off and explained that creating fake evidence to manipulate someone's reputation and relationships was serious, not a misunderstanding. He showed them some of the screenshots from Colton's phone, including the timeline he'd kept of my schedule and the practice conversations he'd written. Colton's mom got quiet and his dad's face went pale. The officer said their son had engaged in a calculated campaign of harassment and defamation that affected multiple people over an extended period. Colton's dad tried to argue that teenage boys do stupid things, and this shouldn't ruin his son's future. The resource officer pointed out that Colton's actions had already affected my future by damaging my reputation and isolating me from normal social relationships. He said the school would determine appropriate consequences, and the family might want to consider getting Colton a lawyer if this went beyond school discipline. Colton's mom started crying and asking if they could just apologize and move past this. The principal explained that the situation involved too many people and too much deliberate deception to handle with a simple apology. The officer finished his documentation and said he'd submit his report to both the school administration and the local police department for review. Colton's parents looked shocked when he mentioned police involvement. Valerie Spivey, the school counselor, found me in the hallway after all the statements were done. She asked if I had a few minutes to talk privately about how I was handling everything. We went to her office with its motivational posters about perseverance and growth, and she closed the door behind us. She asked me to describe what I was feeling right now, and I sat there for a minute trying to figure out how to answer. I admitted I didn't really know what I was feeling because it was all mixed together. Part of me felt relieved that the truth was finally out, and people knew I wasn't actually gay. Part of me was angry at Colton for stealing 2 years of my life and making me question why everyone was acting weird around me. Part of me felt sad about all the time Julia and I lost, because we could have been together this whole time if Colton hadn't interfered. Valerie nodded and said all those reactions were completely normal for someone who'd had their identity stolen and manipulated. She explained that what Colton did was a form of psychological abuse because he deliberately created a false reality around me without my knowledge or consent. She said the grief I was feeling about lost time was valid because I couldn't get those 2 years back, and the relationship Julia and I might have had would always have this shadow over it. I asked if I was supposed to just forgive Colton and move on because that's what people always say you should do. Valerie said forgiveness was a personal choice, and I shouldn't feel pressured to forgive someone who deliberately hurt me just because it made other people more comfortable. She suggested I start coming to regular counseling sessions to process everything that happened and figure out how to move forward. I agreed because I had no idea how to handle any of this on my own. By the time school ended, the story had spread to literally everyone. I walked to my locker and could feel people staring at me from every direction. Some looked sympathetic, some looked shocked, and some were clearly gossiping about what happened. My phone started buzzing constantly with texts and social media notifications. People I barely talked to were messaging me to apologize for assuming I was gay or to say they couldn't believe what Colton did. Some girls I'd tried to talk to sophomore year sent messages saying they felt bad for writing me off as an option. Guys who'd tried to set me up with their gay friends were apologizing for contributing to the false story. Brody sent me a really long text saying he felt terrible about trying to set me up with his cousin last month and that he should have questioned why I never seemed interested in any of the guys he suggested. He said looking back it was obvious I wasn't gay, but Colton's story was so detailed that everyone just believed it. My work friend texted asking if I was okay and if the rumors about Colton manipulating everyone were true. Even some parents in the neighborhood were texting my mom asking what happened because their kids came home talking about it. I had over 100 notifications by the time I got to my car, and they kept coming. Some people were sharing the story on social media with comments about how messed up the whole situation was. A few people were defending Colton and saying maybe he really thought he was helping, but they got shut down pretty fast by everyone else. The school's group chat was completely blowing up with people discussing every detail and sharing their own observations about things that seemed weird in hindsight. That evening, Julia showed up at my house and knocked on the front door. My mom let her in, and she asked if we could sit on the porch like we used to do before everything got complicated. We went outside and sat on the steps where we'd spent so many summer nights talking about random stuff. She was quiet for a minute, picking at the hem of her shirt, and then she asked if there was any chance for us after everything that happened. She wanted to know if Colton had destroyed that possibility completely, or if we could try to figure things out. I looked at her and tried to be completely honest. I told her I still had feelings for her because those hadn't changed even during the 2 years when she was with Colton. But I also admitted I was scared because I didn't know how to trust that this was real after spending so long living in Colton's fake reality. I said I kept wondering if she only thought she had feelings for me now because she felt guilty about believing his lies. Julia started crying and said her feelings were real and had been there all along, even when she was trying to convince herself she was happy with Colton. She explained that she'd always felt something different with me compared to how she felt with him, but she thought that was just because we'd been friends longer. She said now she realized that different feeling was actually romantic attraction that she'd been suppressing because she thought I was gay. I reached over and held her hand, and we sat there for a while, not saying anything. Finally, I told her I wanted to try, but I needed to take things slowly because my head was still messed up from everything. We decided to start by rebuilding our friendship before trying to figure out if romance could work. Julia suggested we go back to doing the things we used to do together before Colton's manipulation, like homework sessions at the library and walking to the school in the mornings. She said maybe if we remembered who we were before all the lies, we could figure out who we wanted to be going forward. I agreed because that made sense and felt less overwhelming than trying to jump straight into dating. We made plans to walk to the school together the next day like we used to do in elementary school. She squeezed my hand before leaving and said she was sorry for everything, even though I kept telling her it wasn't her fault. After she left, I sat on the porch for another hour trying to process everything. It felt both familiar and strange to have her back in my life this way. Familiar because we'd always been close and comfortable together. Strange because now there was this weight of knowing what could have been if Colton hadn't interfered. I kept thinking about all the moments over the past 2 years when I'd wanted to talk to her or hang out, but she'd been distant or busy with Colton. All that time was just gone and we couldn't get it back, but at least now we had a chance to move forward without lies between us. The next day at the school, word spread fast that Colton had been called to the principal's office for a formal disciplinary hearing. People were whispering about it in the hallways between classes, and someone said they saw him walking toward the administrative building looking pale and nervous. By lunch, everyone knew he was suspended pending a full investigation into harassment and creating a hostile environment. The announcement didn't name him specifically, but everyone knew who it was about. Some of his friends who'd been defending him yesterday were suddenly distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with what he'd done. I saw a group of guys who used to hang out with him at lunch deliberately sit at a different table. A few people came up to me throughout the day to say they were glad the school was taking it seriously. One girl said she'd been friends with Colton since middle school, but couldn't believe he'd do something so calculated and cruel. She said she felt stupid for not noticing what he was doing. I told her nobody noticed because Colton was good at hiding his real intentions, which was the whole problem. By the end of the day, Colton's social circle had basically collapsed. People who'd considered him a good friend was now questioning everything they thought they knew about him. Annika Herrera, a junior I'd maybe spoken to twice in my entire life, approached me at lunch with a nervous expression. She asked if she could talk to me privately about something important. We moved to an empty corner of the cafeteria, and she explained that Colton had done something similar to her last year. She said he'd spread rumors that she was obsessed with him and wouldn't leave him alone, which made his friend stop talking to her. She'd liked the friend and they'd been getting close, but after Colton started the rumors, the friend completely cut her off. Annika said she'd tried to deny the rumors, but nobody believed her because Colton had created fake screenshots of texts she supposedly sent him. She'd spent months dealing with people thinking she was a stalker when she'd barely even talked to Colton. She said when she heard what happened with me and Julia, she realized Colton had a pattern of manipulating situations to get what he wanted. She asked if I thought the principal would take her seriously if she came forward now. I told her absolutely yes, and that the resource officer was collecting statements from anyone who'd experienced similar things. Annika looked relieved and said she'd been carrying this around for a year, thinking nobody would believe her. We walked to the principal's office together, and she gave her statement about what Colton had done. The principal's expression got darker as Annika talked, especially when she mentioned the fake screenshots. After Annika left, the principal told me she was grateful people were coming forward because it showed this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior. She said it would strengthen the case for serious disciplinary action. Brandon from my part-time job texted me during my break, asking if I was okay and saying he'd heard about what happened at the school. He said he'd never believed the rumors about me being gay because they didn't match up with how I actually acted. He explained that he'd worked with enough people to recognize when someone was being genuine versus when they were hiding something, and I'd never seemed like I was hiding my sexuality. He said he just figured I was shy about dating or focused on other things. His message made me feel better because it meant at least one person had seen through Colton's lies without needing proof. We started texting more after that, and he invited me to hang out after our shift ended on Friday. He said his friend group was having a game night, and I should come if I wanted a break from all the school drama. I agreed because the idea of being around people who didn't know every detail of what happened sounded amazing. That Friday, we went to his friend's apartment and played video games for hours. Nobody asked me about Colton or Julia or any of it. They just treated me like a normal person who was there to have fun. Brandon introduced me as his coworker and friend, and everyone was cool about it. One of his friends made a joke about me being the baby of the group since I was still in high school, but it was friendly teasing, not mean. Being there felt like breathing fresh air after being stuck in a stuffy room. For a few hours, I could just be myself without thinking about fake texts or lost time or complicated feelings. Julia came over to my house the next evening, and we sat in my backyard on the old lawn chairs. She said she wanted to talk about what dating Colton had actually been like because she'd been avoiding thinking about it, but knew she needed to process it. I told her she didn't have to tell me if it was too hard, but she said she wanted me to understand what those 2 years were really like for her. She admitted she'd never felt the spark with Colton that she'd felt during our late-night talks before everything changed. She'd thought that was normal for relationships, like maybe the excitement she'd felt with me was just friendship and real romance was supposed to be calmer. She said Colton was controlling about her time in ways she hadn't recognized as red flags. He'd get upset when she made plans with other friends without asking him first. He'd show up places where she was supposed to meet people, saying he just wanted to surprise her. He'd text her constantly throughout the day and get annoyed if she didn't respond within a few minutes. Julia said she'd thought he was just really into her and wanted to spend time together. Now she realized he'd been deliberately isolating her from other people, especially from me. She said whenever she'd mention wanting to hang out with me, Colton would have some reason why it wasn't a good idea. He'd say I was probably busy with the guy I was supposedly dating, or that I'd feel uncomfortable being around them as a couple, or that she should give me space to figure out my sexuality. Looking back, she could see how every excuse was designed to keep us apart. She started crying and said she felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. I moved my chair closer and put my arm around her shoulders. I told her she wasn't stupid. Colton was just a really good liar who'd spent months planning how to manipulate both of us. We sat there until it got dark, talking about all the little things that seemed normal at the time, but now looked like warning signs. By the end of the conversation, I think we both felt a little bit lighter, like naming what happened made it easier to carry. That Monday morning, my parents asked me to sit down at the kitchen table before school. My mom had this serious expression that made my stomach twist. She said they wanted to talk about everything that happened with Colton and why I never came to them when people started treating me differently. I tried to explain that the changes were so slow I didn't even notice at first. Girls stopped flirting with me gradually. Guys started making different kinds of jokes around me. It all happened piece by piece over months, not all at once where I could see it clearly. My dad put his hand on my shoulder and said he was angry at himself for not noticing I was struggling. He said they should have paid better attention when I stopped talking about girls or bringing friends over. My mom promised they would do better going forward and asked me to please tell them if anything felt wrong, even if it seemed small. I nodded and felt this weight lift off my chest that I didn't know was there. At the school that week, the principal called an assembly to announce the results of the investigation into Colton's behavior. She didn't use his name, but everyone knew who she meant when she talked about a student being suspended for 10 days for harassment and creating a hostile environment through deliberate deception. The cafeteria buzzed with whispers during lunch. Carly told me that Colton's parents were threatening to sue the school, claiming their son was being unfairly punished for normal teenage relationship drama. But the principal stood firm. She sent an email to all parents explaining that the evidence of calculated manipulation was clear and well documented. Screenshots of fake text apps, browser histories, and witness statements painted an obvious picture. During Colton's suspension, the whole social scene at the school shifted in ways I didn't expect. People who used to hang out with him at lunch started sitting at different tables. I heard them in the hallways talking about how they always thought something was weird about how he acted around me. Some admitted they noticed he would change the subject whenever I was mentioned, or make excuses for why I couldn't join certain hangouts. I realized how many people saw pieces of what was happening, but chose not to get involved because it wasn't their business. It made me angry and sad at the same time, thinking how different things might have been if even one person had spoken up. Julia started texting me multiple times a day to apologize for the 2 years she spent with Colton while I dealt with false rumors alone. I kept telling her she was manipulated too and wasn't responsible for believing elaborate lies backed by fake evidence. She said she felt stupid for not seeing through it sooner, for not questioning why Colton always had reasons to keep us apart. During one of my counseling sessions, Valerie suggested Julia might benefit from talking to someone too, because she was also a victim of Colton's manipulation. I mentioned it to Julia later, and she agreed to set up appointments. She said maybe it would help her stop feeling guilty about something that wasn't her fault. The following Saturday, Carly organized a small group hangout at her house with me, Julia, and a few other friends to help us reconnect without all the school drama hanging over us. It was awkward at first because everyone was being super careful about what they said, like they were worried about triggering some emotional breakdown. But after an hour of playing video games and eating pizza, we all relaxed into our normal rhythms. Julia laughed at one of my stupid jokes about the game we were playing, and I felt this warm feeling spread through my chest. I remembered exactly why I fell for her in the first place, that specific sound of her laugh and the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. 10 days later, Colton returned to the school and tried to act like nothing happened. He walked into first period with his usual confident stride and sat in his normal seat. But people weren't having it. Between classes, several students confronted him in the hallway. I watched from my locker as they called him out for his manipulation, their voices getting louder as more people stopped to listen. He tried to defend himself, but his excuses sounded hollow and pathetic. By lunch, he was eating alone in his car in the parking lot. I saw him through the window and felt this strange mix of satisfaction and pity. His entire social circle had collapsed completely, and he had no one to blame but himself. Brandon texted me that weekend asking if I wanted to hang out with his friend group. He said they were having a game night at someone's apartment, and I should come if I wanted a break from all the school stuff. I agreed immediately because the idea of being around people who didn't know every detail of what happened sounded amazing. His friends were all community college students who treated me like a normal person. They made jokes, played games, and nobody asked about Colton or Julia or any of it. One guy teased me for being the baby of the group since I was still in high school, but it was friendly and made me feel included rather than different. Being there felt like breathing fresh air after being stuck inside for too long. Julia and I started walking to the school together again like we did when we were kids. The first morning felt a little weird, both of us standing on my front porch waiting for the other to say something. But then we just started walking and talking about homework, and it felt natural. Neighbors commented on how nice it was to see us together again. Mrs. Cooper from 3 houses down said she always knew we'd figure things out. Julia's dad made a joke one evening about how he knew we'd end up together eventually, which made both of us turn red and look at our shoes. The familiar routine of walking side by side felt healing, like we were taking back something Colton tried to steal from us. In my next counseling session, Valerie helped me work through my anger at Colton and my complicated feelings about Julia. She asked me to describe what I was feeling, and I admitted it was confusing. Part of me was happy about reconnecting with Julia, but another part was sad about the time we lost. Valerie nodded and said I was allowed to feel both things at once, that being happy about the present while grieving the past made perfect sense. I told her I was scared to pursue anything romantic because I didn't want to rush into something and mess up our rebuilt friendship. She suggested taking things one day at a time and being honest with Julia about my fears. Colton made one final attempt to salvage his reputation by posting on social media that he made mistakes, but everyone was overreacting and blowing things out of proportion. The post went up on a Tuesday night. Within minutes, people started commenting with screenshots of his fake text conversations and browser history. Others shared their own stories of times he lied or manipulated situations. The ratio of critical comments to supportive ones was brutal. He deleted everything within an hour, but screenshots had already spread everywhere. The damage to his credibility was permanent and irreversible, preserved in digital form for anyone who searched his name. Julia caught me after school a few days later, her backpack slung over one shoulder while she fidgeted with her phone case. She asked if I wanted to go to prom together, clarifying quickly that it didn't have to be a date necessarily, but more like friends supporting each other through senior year events. I agreed immediately because the idea of going with her in any capacity sounded better than skipping it entirely or watching from the sidelines while everyone else had fun. Carly appeared from around the corner like she'd been waiting for this exact conversation and volunteered to help coordinate our group so it would feel casual and low pressure. She already had ideas about where we could take pictures and which restaurant had the best pre-prom dinner deals. That weekend, my mom invited Julia's mom over for coffee on our back patio. I was upstairs doing homework when I heard crying through my open window. I walked downstairs quietly and stood in the kitchen where I could hear them talking about everything that happened with Colton. Both of them were crying, their voices thick with emotion as they discussed how thoroughly he manipulated their kids. Julia's mom kept apologizing for not seeing through Colton during the 2 years he dated her daughter, saying she should have noticed something was wrong. My mom told her we all got fooled by someone who turned out to be a skilled liar, that Colton was good at making people believe what he wanted them to believe. I went back upstairs before they could see me listening, but hearing my mom defend both of us made me feel less alone in what happened. Monday morning, Brody caught up with me in the hallway between second and third period. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot while students rushed past us to their classes. He apologized again and admitted he felt guilty for not questioning why I never seemed interested in the guys he tried to set me up with last year. He said looking back, there were signs I wasn't actually gay, but he ignored them because Colton's story seemed so detailed and believable. I told him I didn't blame him for trusting someone we all thought was a good friend, that Colton had fooled everyone with fake evidence and elaborate lies. Brody seemed relieved to hear me say that, his shoulders relaxing as he nodded and said he was glad we could still be cool with each other. The principal called an assembly that Wednesday for all seniors. We filed into the auditorium and sat in our assigned sections while teachers stood along the walls to keep order. The principal talked about the school's commitment to creating a safe environment for everyone, then announced new policies about harassment and bullying that specifically addressed spreading false information about someone's identity or personal life. She mentioned that recent events showed how damaging deliberate deception can be, her voice firm as she explained the consequences for students who violated these policies going forward. Everyone in the auditorium knew she was talking about what Colton did, though she didn't name him directly. I felt people glancing at me and Julia, but this time it didn't feel like judgment, more like acknowledgement that something serious had happened, and the school was actually doing something about it. Friday night, Julia invited me over for a movie night at her house like we used to do before everything got complicated. Her parents were out at dinner with friends, leaving us alone in the living room with popcorn and her Netflix queue pulled up on the TV. We picked some action movie neither of us really cared about and settled onto opposite ends of the couch. Halfway through the film, during a quiet scene, Julia reached over and held my hand. My pulse sped up immediately, and I realized that despite everything that happened, my feelings for her never actually went away. We didn't talk about the hand-holding afterward, just kept watching the movie with our fingers intertwined, but something shifted between us in that moment. The air felt different, charged with possibility instead of weighted down by Colton's lies. News spread through school the following week that Colton's parents were pulling him out 2 weeks before graduation. They enrolled him in an online program to finish his credits from home. Word got around that his family was moving to another town over the summer to give him a fresh start somewhere people didn't know what he did. Part of me felt relieved I wouldn't have to see him at graduation or worry about running into him at senior events. Another part felt like he was escaping consequences by running away instead of facing what he caused. I mentioned this to Julia during lunch and she said at least we wouldn't have to deal with his presence making everything awkward, that maybe him leaving was the best outcome even if it felt like he got off easy. Brandon texted me that Saturday asking if I wanted to come to his apartment for game night with his usual group. When I showed up, his friends were setting up board games on the coffee table and ordering pizza. Brandon pulled me aside during a break between games and said his friend group wanted to adopt me permanently because they thought I was cool and I'd been through too much drama at the school. I joked that I was honored to be adopted, but genuinely appreciated having friends who knew me separate from all the Colton stuff. They invited me to their weekly game nights, and it became a regular thing, giving me a space where I could just be myself without constantly thinking about what happened. Julia met up with Carly for coffee on Sunday afternoon at the place near school. I only found out about their conversation later when Carly tracked me down in the parking lot Monday morning. She told me Julia admitted having feelings for me, but didn't know if pursuing them was fair given everything I'd been through. Carly said she told Julia she was being ridiculous, that I was obviously still into her based on how I looked at her during lunch and between classes. Then Carly turned to me and said the same thing, that we were both dancing around what we actually wanted instead of just being honest with each other. She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my car keys in my hand and my brain spinning. I scheduled an appointment with Valerie during my free period on Tuesday. I sat in her office with its familiar posters about mental health and conflict resolution while I tried to explain my confusion about Julia. I told her I wanted to talk about my feelings and whether it was healthy to pursue a relationship so soon after the manipulation got exposed. Valerie asked what I was afraid of, leaning forward in her chair with her hands folded on her desk. I admitted I was scared Julia only thought she had feelings for me out of guilt or because I was familiar and comfortable after years of friendship. Valerie listened without interrupting, then suggested having an honest conversation with Julia about both our fears instead of making assumptions about what she felt. That evening, Julia and I sat on my porch as the sun went down and the neighborhood got quiet. She told me her feelings were real and not based on guilt, her voice steady and certain in a way that made me believe her. She said she'd been thinking about all the times over the years when she felt something more than friendship, but dismissed it because she thought I only saw her as a friend. I confessed I was scared of getting hurt again or losing her friendship if romance didn't work out, that I couldn't handle losing her twice. Julia reached for my hand and said she was scared too, but maybe being scared together was better than avoiding what we both wanted. We sat there holding hands while neighbors walked their dogs past my house and the streetlights flickered on one by one. We decided that Friday evening to make things official, sitting on my porch while the neighborhood got dark and quiet around us. Julia said we should promise to tell each other if we get scared or confused instead of letting problems build up like what happened with Colton's lies. I agreed and said I wanted to do this right, no more assumptions or leaving things unsaid. She smiled and reached for my hand again, and we sat there for another hour just talking about what dating would actually look like for us. The next day, Julia texted me asking if I wanted to get dinner at Murphy's Diner, the place we'd been going to since middle school for milkshakes and fries. She added that we should call it a date this time instead of just hanging out like we usually did. I showed up at 6 and she was already in our usual booth by the window, wearing a blue sweater I'd never seen before. The whole meal felt different even though we ordered the same things we always got and talked about the same random topics. When I walked her home afterward, she stopped on my doorstep and kissed me goodnight, and my brain went completely blank for a few seconds. I floated back into my house and my mom asked why I was smiling like an idiot, so I told her Julia and I were dating now. She hugged me and said she was happy for us, then made a joke about how she'd been waiting for this since we were kids. By Monday morning at the school, everyone somehow knew Julia and I were together. Carly must have told people because she kept grinning at me in the hallway between classes. Random classmates came up to congratulate us or say they always thought we'd end up dating eventually. Even Mr. Peterson, my history teacher, made a comment after class about how he'd noticed chemistry between us during group projects over the years. Julia met me at my locker before lunch and said at least 5 different people had told her we made a cute couple. The attention was weird but mostly positive, and it felt good to have people acknowledge what we had instead of believing Colton's fake story about my sexuality. During lunch, our friend group made space for us to sit together, and nobody made it awkward or asked invasive questions. Brody stopped by our table to apologize again for trying to set me up with guys, and I told him for the 3rd time that I didn't blame him. Julia squeezed my hand under the table, and I realized I was actually happy at the school for the first time in months. Annika found me in the parking lot after school on Wednesday. She looked nervous but determined, clutching her backpack straps while she told me she wanted to thank me for exposing Colton's manipulation. She said watching me stand up to the false narrative about my sexuality gave her courage to report what Colton did to her last year. I remembered her mentioning something about rumors during the cafeteria aftermath, but I didn't know the full story until now. Annika explained that Colton had spread lies that she was obsessed with him to prevent her from dating his friend, similar to what he'd done to me but with different details. She'd reported it to the principal back then, but without proof and with Colton denying everything, the school couldn't do much. Now with the context of my situation and the evidence Julia found on his laptop, the principal was reopening her case and actually investigating properly. Annika's eyes got watery when she said someone finally believed her and took her seriously. I told her I was sorry she went through that and glad she felt safe coming forward now. She hugged me quickly before leaving, and I stood there realizing Colton had hurt more people than just me and Julia. Prom was 3 weeks later on a Saturday night in the school gymnasium, decorated with silver streamers and twinkle lights. Julia wore a dark green dress that made her eyes look amazing, and I kept staring at her while we waited in line for pictures with our friend group. Carly and her date, some guy from her math class, posed with us for photos that would probably end up in the yearbook. The lead up to prom had been complicated with all the Colton drama still fresh, but being there with Julia made me glad we decided to go. We danced with our friends during the fast songs, and when a slow song came on, Julia pulled me close and wrapped her arms around my neck. She looked up at me and said she was happy we didn't let Colton's lies destroy what we could have together. I agreed and kissed her right there on the dance floor in front of half our senior class, not caring who saw or what anyone thought. Some people nearby clapped or whistled, and Julia laughed against my lips before pulling me back in for another kiss. The rest of prom was a blur of dancing and laughing and taking too many photos, but that moment on the dance floor stuck with me as proof that we'd made it through everything. My parents threw a graduation party at our house 2 weeks before the actual ceremony, inviting relatives and neighbors, including Julia's family. The backyard was full of folding tables with food and a banner my mom hung up that said, "Congratulations." Julia's parents brought a cake, and her dad spent 20 minutes talking to my dad about lawn care while our moms gossiped inside. Julia and I were standing by the snack table when her dad pulled me aside near the fence. He put his hand on my shoulder and said he was glad I finally told Julia how I felt, even if the circumstances were messy and complicated. He'd known me since I was 10 years old and apparently spent years hoping Julia and I would figure things out. Then he made a joke about how he was starting to think I'd never make a move, and I felt my face get hot with embarrassment. Julia appeared next to us and asked what we were talking about, and her dad just laughed and walked away. She looked at me with raised eyebrows, so I explained that her dad was giving me the approval talk. Julia rolled her eyes, but she was smiling, and we went back to the party where my relatives kept asking about our college plans. Graduation practice happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the auditorium, where they made us line up alphabetically and walk through the ceremony 3 times. I stood in my spot between Anderson and Acosta and noticed Colton's empty seat 2 rows ahead where Barrett would have been. The absence felt strange, and I couldn't stop staring at the gap in the lineup. Part of me was angry about everything he'd done, the 2 years of lies and manipulation that hurt both me and Julia. But another part felt sad that a friendship I'd valued since elementary school turned out to be fake the whole time. I'd trusted Colton with everything, and he used that trust to steal the person I loved. During a break in practice, I mentioned the mixed emotions to Valerie, who was helping coordinate the ceremony. She said it was normal to grieve the friend I thought I had while being angry at the person he actually was, that those feelings could exist at the same time. She also said I didn't have to figure out how to feel right away, that processing betrayal takes time. I nodded and went back to my spot in line, trying to focus on graduation instead of Colton's empty seat. Julia and I spent the day before graduation at the local pool, where we'd spent so many childhood summers. The place was mostly empty on a Thursday afternoon, just us and a few families with little kids. We claimed our old spot near the deep end and spread out towels on the hot concrete. Julia brought up college and how we were going to make long-distance work with her at State University and me at Tech 3 hours apart. I admitted I was nervous about the distance but wanted to try, because losing her again wasn't an option. She said we survived 2 years of Colton's manipulation and lies, so we could definitely handle some distance with honest communication. We talked about visiting each other on weekends and video calling every night, making plans that felt both exciting and scary. Then we spent the rest of the afternoon swimming and lying in the sun, not talking about anything serious. Julia did a cannonball off the diving board like she used to do when we were kids, and I remembered all the summers we'd spent here before everything got complicated. The lifeguard blew his whistle at 6 to close the pool, and we walked home through the neighborhood as the sun went down. Graduation day was hot and bright, with rows of metal chairs set up on the football field for the ceremony. My family sat somewhere in the middle section, while Julia's family was a few rows behind them. We had to line up backstage in our caps and gowns, and the whole senior class was buzzing with energy and emotion. When they started calling names alphabetically, I waited through the A's and B's until they got to my row. My name echoed through the speakers, and I walked across the stage to shake the principal's hand and grab my diploma. My family and Julia's family both cheered really loud, and I could hear my mom's voice above everyone else. Back in my seat, I watched Julia walk across the stage 20 minutes later when they got to the Z's, and our whole section clapped for her. After the ceremony ended and we threw our caps in the air, Julia found me in the crowd of graduates and families. We took pictures together with our diplomas while our parents stood nearby, taking even more pictures on their phones. I thought about how different this moment would have been if Colton's lies had never been exposed, if I'd graduated still trapped in his fake narrative. Instead, I was here with Julia, both of us free to be honest about our feelings. The summer after graduation felt like making up for lost time. Julia and I spent almost every day together, going on actual dates instead of just hanging out as friends. We drove to the movies in the next town over, went hiking at the state park, and had picnics by the lake. Sometimes we just sat on my porch or hers talking for hours like we used to do before Colton's manipulation drove us apart. Her parents made jokes about me being at their house so much that I should start paying rent, but they were clearly happy we were together. My mom kept asking when Julia was coming over for dinner, and my dad taught both of us how to grill burgers on the back deck. We had long conversations about our fears and feelings, slowly building trust in what we had. Julia admitted she sometimes worried I'd realize I was better off without her after everything that happened. I told her that was ridiculous and kissed her to prove my point. We were figuring things out together, learning how to be in a relationship built on honesty instead of lies. Brandon texted me in late July saying his friends were throwing a going-away party for me before I left for college. I showed up at his apartment on Saturday night and found his whole friend group there, plus Julia, who Brandon had invited separately. They'd ordered pizza and set up video games, and everyone spent the first hour telling Julia embarrassing stories about me from work. Brandon's roommate said I once dropped an entire tray of drinks during a rush and just stood there staring at the mess. Julia laughed and said that sounded exactly like something I'd do. Later in the evening, people started saying goodbye and telling Julia she better take care of me at college, even though we'd be at different schools. She promised she would and squeezed my hand. Brandon pulled me aside near the door and said he was glad things worked out for me after everything with Colton. He said I deserved to be happy, and Julia seemed like a good person who genuinely cared about me. I thanked him for being a real friend when I needed one, for giving me a space outside all the school drama. He hugged me and told me to stay in touch, then sent us home with leftover pizza. I ran into Brody at the mall 2 weeks before college started while shopping for dorm supplies. He was coming out of the electronics store with a new laptop bag and almost walked right past me before doing a double take. We ended up grabbing food court pizza and sitting at one of those sticky tables near the fountain. Brody told me Colton's family actually did move away like everyone had been saying. Apparently they relocated to some town about 4 hours away where nobody knew about what happened. Colton was going to community college there, according to what Brody heard from mutual friends who still followed him on social media. Brody said some of Colton's old friends from our school still felt guilty about not seeing through his manipulation sooner. They'd been posting vague stuff about recognizing red flags and supporting victims. I told Brody we all got fooled by someone who turned out to be really good at lying. There wasn't any point dwelling on it now since Colton was gone, and I had my own life to focus on. Brody seemed relieved I wasn't angry at everyone who believed the fake story. He asked how things were going with Julia, and I told him we were good, trying to figure out the whole long-distance thing. He said he was happy for us, and that he always thought we'd make a good couple back before all the drama happened. Julia came over to my house 3 days before we both left for college. We sat on my back porch where we'd spent so many nights talking over the years. She brought up the elephant in the room right away, saying we needed to talk seriously about what happens when we're at different schools. I admitted I was scared about long distance because I'd heard so many stories about couples breaking up freshman year. Julia said she wasn't willing to lose me again after we finally got the chance to be together for real. She reminded me we'd already survived 2 years of Colton's manipulation keeping us apart. A few hours of driving between campuses seemed manageable compared to that. We promised each other we'd visit regularly and be honest about any problems instead of letting them build up. Julia said communication was the most important thing, and we couldn't let distance create the kind of space Colton had used to drive us apart before. I agreed, and we spent the rest of the evening planning our first few visits. She'd come to my campus for homecoming in October. I'd go to hers for her birthday in November. We'd both be home for Thanksgiving and winter break. Having actual dates on the calendar made it feel more real and less scary. Move-in day arrived on a hot August morning. My parents loaded up our SUV with boxes and bags while I triple-checked my packing list. Julia showed up at 8 in the morning even though we weren't leaving until 9 because she wanted to help. The 3-hour drive to my college felt both too long and too short. My mom kept giving me advice about laundry and eating vegetables while my dad focused on driving. Julia held my hand in the back seat and took pictures of road signs as we got closer to campus. The dorm parking lot was chaos when we arrived. Families everywhere were unloading cars and wheeling carts full of stuff toward the buildings. My room was on the 3rd floor, and we made about 6 trips up and down the stairs carrying everything. My new roommate was already there setting up his side when we walked in. His name was Darren, and he seemed cool right away. He helped us carry the last few boxes up and joked about how much stuff I brought. The best part was Darren didn't know anything about my high school drama. He had no idea about Colton or the fake gay rumors or any of it. I was just a regular freshman to him. We spent 2 hours setting up my side of the room while my parents assembled the desk chair they'd bought. Julia organized my closet and put sheets on my bed. When everything was done, my parents took us all out for lunch at a restaurant near campus. They embarrassed me by taking about 100 photos of me and Julia together. My mom cried a little when it was time for them to leave. Julia walked them down to the parking lot with me, and my mom hugged her for a long time. She told Julia to take care of me, and Julia promised she would. After my parents drove away, Julia and I went back up to my room. Darren had gone somewhere to give us privacy. Julia kissed me goodbye and said she'd see me in 3 weeks when I visited her campus. She made me promise to text her when I woke up every morning. I walked her down to her car and watched her drive away. Going back to my empty dorm room felt weird and lonely. The first few weeks of college were a bigger adjustment than I expected. Classes were harder and nobody told you what to do or when to do it. I had to figure out my own schedule and manage my time without teachers or parents reminding me about assignments. My roommate Darren turned out to be a good match. He was studying engineering and spent most nights doing problem sets at his desk. We developed a routine where we'd get dinner together at the dining hall, then come back and work on homework. Having Julia to text and video chat with made everything easier. We talked every single night about our classes and new friends and how much we missed each other. She'd tell me about her roommate who was obsessed with some band I'd never heard of. I'd tell her about the weird guy down the hall who practiced trumpet at 2 in the morning. Darren commented one night that I smiled every time my phone buzzed with a message from her. He said it was obvious I was in a serious relationship based on how often we talked. I told him Julia and I had known each other since we were 10, and he said that explained why we seemed so solid already. Some of the other guys on my floor were hooking up with random people at parties, but I had zero interest in any of that. I just wanted to get through the weeks until I could see Julia in person again. I drove to Julia's campus for the first time on a Friday afternoon in late September. The drive took 3.5 hours because I got lost twice trying to find her dorm. She was waiting outside when I finally pulled up and ran over to my car before I even finished parking. We spent the whole weekend together exploring her college town. She introduced me to her new friends on Saturday at lunch, and they all said they'd heard so much about me. Her roommate seemed nice and made jokes about how Julia talked about me constantly. We walked around campus and Julia showed me her favorite spots. The library where she studied between classes, the coffee shop where she got breakfast sandwiches, the quad where everyone hung out when the weather was nice. On Saturday night, we went to a party at someone's apartment off campus. It was loud and crowded, but I didn't care because Julia was with me. Being with her in person again after a month apart felt right. All my worries about long distance seemed stupid. We could definitely make this work if we put in the effort. Sunday morning came too fast and I had to drive back to my campus for a group project meeting. Julia walked me to my car and kissed me goodbye. She said 3 weeks until she visited me, and I needed to show her all my favorite places. I drove back feeling confident about us. Julia visited my campus in October, and I introduced her to my new friends. They all immediately liked her, which made me happy. Darren said she was cool, and he could see why I talked about her all the time. We went to the homecoming football game together on Saturday. Julia wore my school colors to support me, even though she went to a different college. We sat in the student section, and she cheered louder than anyone when we scored. One of my friends from my floor commented that we seemed really solid for a new relationship. I explained we'd actually known each other since we were 10. He said that made sense because we acted like we'd been together for years. After the game, we all went out for pizza, and Julia fit right in with my friend group. She told embarrassing stories about me from high school that made everyone laugh. I pretended to be annoyed, but I loved watching her get along with my new friends. That night, after everyone else left, Julia and I walked around campus in the dark. She said she was proud of me for building a good life here. I told her the same thing about her campus. We were both making it work. Thanksgiving break came, and Julia and I were both back in our neighborhood. It felt strange being home after months away at college. Everything looked the same but felt different somehow. We spent time with both our families over the long weekend. Her parents hosted Thanksgiving dinner and invited my family over. My mom brought 2 pies and my dad carved the turkey. Julia's dad made a joke during dinner about when we were getting married. Everyone laughed, but I noticed Julia didn't seem bothered by the idea. She just smiled and squeezed my hand under the table. After dinner, we took a walk around the neighborhood like we used to do growing up. The houses all had their Christmas lights up already. We walked past Colton's old house, which had new people living in it now. Julia said it was weird seeing different cars in the driveway. We talked about how far we'd come since last spring when everything exploded in the cafeteria. Back then, we didn't even know if we'd make it as a couple. Now we were making long-distance work and planning our futures. Julia said she couldn't imagine her life without me in it anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Annika in early December. She said she was doing well and wanted to thank me again for helping expose Colton's pattern of manipulation. Apparently, she'd been in therapy since last spring working through trust issues. Her therapist helped her understand she wasn't stupid for believing Colton's lies about her. She said therapy was teaching her how to trust people again and recognize red flags. I texted back that I was proud of her for speaking up when she did. Her statement to the principal had helped show Colton had a history of this behavior. I told her she deserved good things, and I hoped college was going well for her. She said she was at community college close to home, but planning to transfer somewhere bigger next year. We texted back and forth for a while, catching up. It felt good knowing she was doing better. Julia and I celebrated our 6-month anniversary over winter break in late December. We went out to dinner at the nice Italian restaurant in town. She gave me a wrapped present when we got back to her house. Inside was a framed photo of us from prom night. We were standing together in front of the photo backdrop looking happy. Julia said she wanted me to have it in my dorm as a reminder that we were worth the effort of long distance. She'd written the date on the back of the frame along with a note saying she loved me. I stared at the note for a long time. We'd been dating for 6 months, but neither of us had actually said those words out loud yet. I looked up at Julia and told her I loved her. She smiled and said it back without any hesitation. We sat on her porch talking until past midnight. Being home together felt easy and comfortable. I didn't want winter break to end. Spring semester started in January, and we'd found a good rhythm with our long-distance relationship. We visited each other once a month and talked every single day. Video calls before bed became our routine. Julia would tell me about her day while getting ready for bed. I'd tell her about mine while lying in my dorm. Darren joked one night that I was basically married already. Honestly, he wasn't wrong about how committed we were. Some guys on my floor were still hooking up with random people at parties. I had a girlfriend I'd known since elementary school, and we were making it work across 3 hours of distance. I thought about how Colton tried to destroy this and completely failed. He'd moved away and lost all his friends. Julia and I were stronger than ever. I felt grateful we got our chance to be together for real. Everything Colton did to keep us apart just made us more sure about each other once the truth came out. I had Julia's prom photo on my desk where I could see it every day. Darren asked about it once and I told him the whole story. He said we'd been through more drama than most married couples. I laughed, but he had a point. We'd survived manipulation, lies, and distance. We could survive anything. I scrolled through Instagram one night in March and saw Colton's profile pop up in my suggested follows. He'd changed his profile picture to something generic, and his bio said he was at community college in whatever town his family moved to. The photos showed him with new people at parties and study groups, all of them smiling like they were having a great time. None of them knew what he'd done to me and Julia. Part of me wanted to message them or comment something that would expose his history, but I stopped myself before typing anything. It wasn't my job to follow Colton around warning every new person he met about his past. He'd have to live with what he did, and those people would figure him out eventually if he tried the same manipulative stuff again. I closed Instagram and texted Julia instead, telling her about some funny thing that happened in my biology lab. She was my focus now, not Colton and whatever fake life he was building somewhere else. Julia showed up at my dorm on a Friday afternoon in April without warning. I was sitting at my desk studying when someone knocked, and I opened the door to find her standing there with an overnight bag and a huge smile. She said she missed me too much to wait until our planned visit next week and drove 3 hours just to surprise me. We spent the whole weekend exploring the city near campus, walking through parks and trying restaurants I'd been wanting to check out. She held my hand the entire time and kept saying how much she loved being able to do normal couple things without everyone at the school watching us. On Saturday night, we got pizza and sat on a bench overlooking the river, talking about summer plans. Julia wanted us to take a road trip together, maybe drive down the coast and stay in cheap motels along the way. She said dating me felt easy because we already knew everything about each other, all the embarrassing stories and weird habits and childhood memories. There was no pretending or trying to impress anyone. I kissed her and told her that was exactly why I'd loved her since we were 10 years old. Finals week arrived in May, and Julia and I spent hours on video calls studying together, even though we were taking completely different classes. Between study sessions, we'd talk about how crazy it was that a year ago, we were dealing with the cafeteria breakup and all of Colton's lies coming out. We'd gone from childhood friends who got manipulated into thinking we couldn't be together, to a couple making long-distance work across 3 hours of highway. Julia said she was actually grateful everything came out when it did, even though the timing was painful and public. If Colton's lies had continued any longer, we might have lost even more time or drifted apart completely when we went to different colleges. At least this way we knew the truth and could build something real. She said the manipulation made us stronger as a couple, because we'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to a relationship before it even started. I agreed and told her I couldn't imagine my life without her in it anymore. Summer arrived and we both came home to work part-time jobs and spend every possible moment together. Julia got her old job back at the ice cream shop, and I worked at the hardware store like I did in high school. We'd meet up after our shifts and drive around town or hang out at each other's houses like we used to do as kids. My parents joked that I was never home anymore because I was always across the street at Julia's place. Her dad said he was glad we finally figured out what everyone else had known since we were 10. The summer felt perfect and simple, just us being together without the stress of distance or school drama or people talking about what happened last year. I thought about how I'd planned to tell Julia my feelings after graduation, this big romantic confession I'd been building up to for years. It didn't happen the way I imagined at all. Life got messy and complicated, and someone I trusted tried to destroy everything. But we still ended up together anyway, building something real based on honesty and actual feelings instead of manipulation and lies. We were happy, and that's what mattered most.